Hey, I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain. In this video, we're going to show you how to rebuild the top end on your KTM, Husky, or GasGas 65cc dirt bike. To keep these bikes running good, they do need a little bit of maintenance from time to time. Now, KTM recommends replacing that piston every 40 hours of use, but if you haven't been keeping track of the hours, then some common symptoms of a worn out top end would be a loss of power or the bike is hard to start. Now, you can verify those issues by doing a compression test and compare your compression reading to the readings you've been doing during your routine maintenance. At least hopefully you've been doing that. And once you notice those compression readings start to drop, then you know you need to get in there and replace your top end parts. Now, some of you might have a top end failure, but whatever the reason is that you're rebuilding your top end, we're going to show you how to do it on this 2015 KTM 65SX. But the process will be similar for any late model KTM or Husky 65 or the new GasGas 65s, whether it be an SX, an XC, a TC, or an MC. Now, throughout the process, you want to refer to your model specific service manual for any minor differences, more information, and specs. As far as parts go, you have a few different options for pistons, and for these bikes, you can actually get these in a couple different sizes. We'll talk about that later in the video, but you're going to need a piston kit. So that comes with your piston, the ring, circlips, and the wrist pin. The wrist pin bearing is going to come separately, so make sure you get that. Then you're also going to want to have a spark plug and some gaskets. This is the Tusk gasket set for the top end. You want some assembly lube or two-stroke oil, some contact cleaner, and of course some coolant. To do this job, we have some rubber gloves, safety glasses, rags, common hand tools. That includes our torque wrench, Allen keys, sockets, that kind of thing. I want to specifically point out the 6mm combo wrench. We have our digital calipers, a gasket scraper. We also have our Tusk decking and timing tool. And then this is a Motion Pro hose removal tool. I really like this thing, it works great. And we also have a vacuum cap to plug up our fuel line and some feeler gauges. All right, guys, the first thing we need to do is gain access to the area we're working on. So we're going to remove our seat and our gas tank. After that, we can go ahead and remove the exhaust system. Then we'll remove that power valve hose. And after that, we can go ahead and drain our coolant. And then we'll reinstall our bolt with a new crush washer. Before we start tearing the top end apart, I'm going to plug up the fuel line and clean away any loose dirt. From here, we're going to remove both radiators. So I'm going to disconnect the hoses first. Now we can remove our spark plug cap and the spark plug. Now we're going to remove the 3 bolts on top of that power valve cap. And then remove the cap. And we'll use an 8mm socket to remove the nut on top. Then from there we can go ahead and remove the diaphragm. We're going to let that shaft fall back into place. And then we'll remove that whole housing. So we're using a 4mm Allen for that top bolt. And a 5mm Allen for that lower bolt. And we'll pull this off. Keep in mind there's that spring that you want to pay attention to. And we also have an O-ring on the back side of that cup. So I'm just going to remove that spring. Now our power valve is broken and the rod came out with it. Typically that's not going to happen unless your power valve is broken like ours is. And remove that power valve hose the rest of the way. So at this point we're going to loosen the 4 cylinder head bolts in a crisscross pattern, just about a 1/4 turn, and then remove those bolts out of the way and remove the cylinder head. And you want to keep an eye out for the 2 locating pins. We had one stay in the cylinder head and one in the cylinder. All right, now we're going to pull this head gasket off. Then we've got this broken power valve piece, but it's locking up on something, so we're going to pull the cylinder before we deal with that. So we're going to go ahead, loosen the base gasket nuts in a crisscross pattern. And one thing I want to point out is, just to help get the cylinder all the way off a little bit easier, I'm going to rotate the Kickstarter until the piston is actually at the lowest point. So right there. If your cylinder's stuck, you can use a mallet to knock the sides to knock it free. Then you can use your other hand to kind of catch that piston. From here, we'll use some needle nose pliers or a pick to remove the circlip. Then from the other side, you can either use a wrist pin puller or something to push on the wrist pin to remove it. So once it's out far enough, you can go ahead, pull the piston from the connecting rod and remove that needle bearing. Now before we go any further, we want to inspect this connecting rod. We're going to start with the big end bearing. So we need to make sure there's no up and down play in this connecting rod. So I'm going to move it to one side and pull straight up and down on it. Now if you feel any up and down play, you want to either rebuild your crank or get the whole thing replaced. Now one thing I want to point out is a little rocking motion from side to side is normal. That's why I try to pull the rod to one side and then pull up and down. And if you just want to verify everything's in good condition, your standard side clearance on the side of that big end bearing between the web and there's that washer in there. Standard side clearance is 0.4 to 0.75 millimeters. And you know, we have the 0.75, it doesn't fit in there. So we know we're good. If you can put a feeler gauge in there that's a lot bigger than 0.75, then, you know, again, this is probably worn out and you either need to rebuild or replace. All right, with that inspected, we're going to clean this base gasket sealing surface just with a gasket scraper. Scrape any big chunks. You can use a wire brush on these studs if they're corroded, and then we're going to use a rag and contact cleaner to do the final cleaning on the surface. Now for the small end, you just want to look in there and check for any grooves or galling. Make sure there's no pitting. You know, ours is looking good. So we're going to install our new needle bearing and the wrist pin. And we're just going to pull straight up and down on that. You know, we don't feel any play in there, so we know it's good. If you feel play in there, then, you know, that means your small end of that connecting rod is bad, and again, it will need to be replaced. All right, so we're going to take a quick look at all these parts. Now, obviously, we had this power valve that was stuck, and looks like the ends got mushroomed over, and then this, you know, that rod got broken off. So we're going to need to check inside here and make sure that these surfaces are not damaged. And, you know, if there's minor damage, we might be able to clean it up, but we're just going to take the new one in and slide that down in there. If it slides smooth, we're going to keep this cylinder. If it does not go in or hangs up really bad, we might have to replace this. So we'll check that out in a minute, but for now, you know, we're going to start cleaning everything up. And, you know, I'm kind of thinking the reason everything was so gummed up in here is because this thing was stuck down. So you can see the spark plug, you know, this has a ton of oil buildup in it. And then when we took the expansion chamber off and our silencer off, just oil was pouring out of those. So definitely had some issues going on, and you know, everything else seems not too bad. So we're just going to go ahead and clean all this stuff up, and we're going to even remove this flange and replace that gasket. And with this diaphragm, we're just checking for tears. We're going to wipe all that oil off. And make sure to remove this O-ring. There's also two small O-rings on the cylinder head that we'll remove. So now that we're clean, we're going to take that flange off and we're going to scrape this gasket surface. And, you know, we already removed the base gasket, but if you had any remaining pieces left on your cylinder, now would be a good time to scrape that as well. Now that we have everything cleaned up, we're going to do a quick visual inspection to our cylinder. So we need to check this Nikasil coating, and we're looking for a crosshatch pattern that's still in there. If you don't see that, chances are it's worn down pretty good. Or if you see any grooves in the side of the cylinder, you can run your fingernail across there, and if it catches, you're going to want to get it recoated. Now, if you don't see the crosshatch pattern and you need this measured out and you don't have the right tools, you can take it to your machine shop and have them measure it just to verify if it can be reused or not. And just refer to the specs that are in your manual. Now, one more thing we see with these two strokes is sometimes some aluminum can transfer over from the piston to the cylinder wall. So if you had a partial seizure or full-on seizure, maybe you see that. If you want to know more about that and how to get that aluminum off, then watch our Nikasil inspection video. For us, we're just going to run a hone through this, and we're going to do the final cleaning with some soap and water. Now for the cylinder head, if you had any issues with overheating, you definitely want to check this for warpage, and that procedure is outlined in your manual. But if you didn't have any issues, you're probably good. Now, if there's a ton of carbon buildup in here, you can let this soak in some carbon remover to help get rid of some of that. Now back to the power valve. The issue we had with our bike is pretty common with these bikes, and you need to make sure you get in there and make some inspections. When we looked down in ours, we did have some light damage, and we cleaned that up with some small files. Once everything was cleaned up, we verified that the new power valve slid in smoothly and didn't hang up in any spots. But if you have severe damage in there, you're definitely going to want to replace the cylinder. Now when you go to order a piston, you might notice that some pistons just have one size, and if you get the standard size, that's going to work great. But some pistons, they offer two different sizes. They have very minor differences to them. And you know, if you look at the bottom corner of your cylinder, you might notice an A or a B. Ours doesn't have it, but A is the smaller size, B is the bigger size. Now, if you had the machine shop measure this out for you, you can just go off that measurement. Or if you just have digital calipers at home, these are going to be close enough to at least let you know if you're getting the right piston. So we're right at 45.04 millimeters. So for this cylinder, we would actually use a B piston, but if we just got the standard size, that would work just fine. All right, now we need to get our new piston ready. Now, the ring end gap, the service manual isn't giving us a minimum spec, just a maximum, but we already measured our cylinder. We know it's good, so we're not going to do that. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to install our circlip into the piston. You want this open side either facing up or down at the 12 or 6 o'clock position. We're using a small flat blade screwdriver as our ramp to help get the circlip into place. If you do this, make sure you only compress the circlip the minimum amount so you don't damage it when you install it. Now we're going to install our exhaust flange and use a new gasket for that. And don't forget to put this spring mount on. Now over here at the bike, we're going to install this piston ring onto our piston. We have that R or marking that's going to be facing up on the ring, and then you have the locating pin in your piston. Make sure the ring end gap lines up with that locating pin. We'll just start with one side, set it in the groove, and work it all the way around. Just be careful not to scratch up your piston. Then we're going to apply assembly lube to the piston skirt, the ring, and these wrist pin bosses. Then we'll apply assembly lube to the wrist pin. Then we'll lube up that needle bearing and install it into the connecting rod. Then on top of the piston, we have that arrow that's going to face the exhaust side. So we're going to slide this over the rod and slide that wrist pin through the wrist pin bearing. Now we're going to install the circlip into one side of the piston, and all you need to do is set the clip into its groove on one side, and then you're going to work it in all the way around and just keep pressure on it with one of your thumbs. And then when you get to the end, you can kind of rock it into place by using a small flat blade screwdriver. Once you have the circlip snapped into place, just verify that it's all the way in there. I'm going to move the rags away from the piston, and we just left those there to make sure we didn't drop those circlips into the bottom end. And I'm going to rotate that piston to its lowest point just to help us get the cylinder in. And we're also going to apply assembly lube to the cylinder. Next, we're going to install our base gasket, and you can get different size base gaskets, and that's going to help you get the correct deck height. But first, we need to install our cylinder. So what we're going to do is make sure when we compress that ring, make sure it's still lined up with that locating pin. Line up the ring and compress it. And then before I do anything else, I'm just going to verify that everything's correct. So I'm just going to rotate this piston up and down, make sure everything moves smooth. So we know that ring went in correctly. Put that at the highest point. And then we'll install the cylinder nuts. Now we're going to tighten these base nuts in a crisscross pattern to 14.8 foot-pounds. Now to check the deck height, what we're going to do is remove our magneto cover. To take the measurement, I'm just going to rotate the flywheel counterclockwise a little bit and then set the tool in place. We're using the side that says X measurement. Sit that flush against the cylinder head, and then, you can see the piston pushes the tool away from the cylinder. You do not want that. You want either no gap, so it barely greets the tool, or you can have up to 0.1 millimeters gap between the top of the piston at its highest point and the tool. So for us, since the piston is pushing the tool away from the cylinder, we're going to have to add thickness to our base gasket to bring the cylinder up to the height of that piston. Now, if you are using the thickest gasket and still have this issue, you can add multiple gaskets together, or if the piston is just too low, you can use a thinner gasket to bring that piston height up. So we're going to go ahead and remove our cylinder and change out the gasket. For the amount our piston was sticking out, I'm just adding a 0.4 millimeter gasket. So even with that 0.4, it's still pushing on my tool just a little bit. So we need to add one thicker gasket. Now we can check the X measurement again. The piston is not pushing up on our tool, so we're probably good, but if you see any gap at all between the tool and the top of the piston, you can use a feeler gauge to measure that, and as long as you're under the 0.1 millimeter spec, you're good. Now, the feeler gauge, you're just going to go until you find one that has a slight drag on it, and that's your measurement. Now for the timing height, we're going to use the part of the tool that steps out just a little bit, and we're going to back the piston up a little bit. We're going to go clockwise with that flywheel, and then once this is in place, you can go counterclockwise with that flywheel until the piston greets the tool. So right there. And then we're going to check our timing mark on the flywheel versus that timing plate. So ours is just barely off. We've got line on the flywheel, line on the timing plate. We're going to loosen up these screws. There's 3 of them. Once everything's perfectly lined up, I'm just going to use the tool, double check where everything needs to be. So we have everything exactly in the right spot. Now we can go ahead and torque these timing plate bolts down. Now we can lube up the power valve and set it into place. Then we'll install this cylinder head gasket or O-ring. Next, we're going to install the cylinder head. Make sure you have those 2 dowel pins in place still. Now we'll install the cylinder head bolts. It's a good idea to use new copper washers and torque those in a crisscross pattern to 13.3 foot-pounds. Then we have this power valve spring, a couple O-rings. And we have the bottom of this cup for the diaphragm. We'll install our new O-ring that came in the gasket set on there. And we can install the 2 bolts and the copper washers. Now we're going to install the diaphragm, and then we'll put that nylock nut on a few threads. Take your 6mm open end, pull up on the nut, hold the shaft with the open end, and we'll tighten down the nut. Now we can install the diaphragm cap. Now we'll install our new spark plug. Now I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the radiators. And we're going to fill the bike with coolant. Now we're going to install our spark plug cap, our radiator louvers, and our magneto cover. At this point, we can go ahead and reinstall the exhaust system. We already installed the new O-rings that came in the gasket kit onto our pipe. Don't forget your hose. And now we can install our tank and our seat. All right, now we're ready to start this thing up. For us, we're gonna bring this up to operating temperature, shut it off, let it cool down, and we're gonna double check our fluids. Now, with this, we like to take it easy on the first ride and then ride it how we normally would, but you always wanna refer to your model-specific service manual for any specific break-in procedures. So let's go ahead and start it up. That's all there is to rebuilding your KTM, Husky, or GasGas 65cc dirt bike. If you need any of the parts we used today, check out our website. We have a lot of different options on there, and we offer free shipping on orders over $75. Now, we ran into some weird issues with our power valve on this bike. If you've seen any weird issues with these 65s, we want to know about those. Leave them down in the comments below. Maybe you can help somebody else out. Now, if you like this video and want to see more like it, subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.